I wanted to say it's an absolute pleasure to be here and to talk to you this afternoon. I've been a Chief Resilience Officer in Greater Manchester since 2017, and I think I'm one of 4 in the UK. So London has a Chief Resilience Officer, Belfast and Glasgow. But there's a community internationally of us, so we pop up in other cities around the world. I've been working in the field of resilience for nearly 20 years. So just to say that's my background, and I'm not going to share the whole lot with you today, but hopefully a few points. So I'm just going to try and move slides on. Just fail at this point. There we go. I wanted to talk to you today about really 2 decades of building urban resilience in Greater Manchester. So it's our story, if you like. And I'll look at some of the governance arrangements because I think they're important. I'll talk about some of the risks and incidents that we faced because they tend to shape our approach. And then I'm looking to the future in terms of how we strengthen urban resilience in Greater Manchester. So I think my starting point, so when I'm talking about urban resilience, I've said I'll look at the last sort of 20 years. But I always start by saying city resilience is not a new concept. So it has recently come to prominence in academic literature. We're now appointing resilience practitioners. But, you know, if you just take a step back, and if I take you back to 1605 in Manchester, and that was a time of the bubonic plague. And Manchester lost 25% of its population to the bubonic plague. It had 3,000 people living in it at the time. But really interestingly, some of the characteristics of that time, you can find echoes of them in today. So the people that were disproportionately affected were the poor. So the more affluent could move out of Manchester and move into the hills and the countryside and avoid the plague in that sense. But actually those remaining in the city were subject to the full severity of it. It took 30 years for the population to recover back to the size it was before that plague. So my contention is that cities have been dealing with crises and challenge ever since they've been formed. But now we're looking at that in a different way. We're trying to be more sophisticated and we're trying to plan for the future. So this timeline is simply some of the highlights of our journey, depending on how you look at things, but it goes right back to 2004. And I'm sure all of you will be aware that 2004 sees the Civil Contingencies Act coming into force in the UK. And although it's been reviewed over the years, it still forms the statutory basis of everything that we do today. And it learned from a whole series of crises around about the turn of the century. We had foot and mouth, we had flooding, we had fuel strikes, and there was a sense that we could respond to those a great deal better than we had done. Now, Civil Contingencies Act might be 20 years old, but I think it does some really good stuff. It starts by defining an emergency. And actually, when you work in the field, that's quite important because, you know, you can get drawn into smaller crises, which are really just the top end of business as usual service delivery. And I'll show you one where you can almost miss the emergency if you're not careful. So it defines emergencies, those events or situations that threaten serious damage to human welfare, to the environment, or to our security. It also creates local resilience forums, and the one acronym I will drift into is LRF, Local Resilience Forum. And they're the multi-agency, cross-sector, they're private and public sector partnerships that coordinate civil contingencies activity at the local level. And Karina mentioned that we've done some work internationally. And when I talk to colleagues in other cities, they're like, have you done that? How have you got that partnership together, talking and working? And so I think they're a fundamental component of what we do well in the UK. We might come on to how they can be improved, but I think they're a really good starting block. The one thing this Act does is it makes resilience synonymous with emergency preparedness, response and recovery. So I won't talk too much about the definition of resilience, but you've probably all got your own. And you probably know UN ones or 100 resilient cities or other definitions of resilience. But in the UK, particularly amongst sort of practitioners, there's a tendency to think of it in terms of emergency preparedness and response. So, moving forwards, 10 years, I'm just going to skip through the 20. 2014, Greater Manchester joins the Making Cities Resilient initiative. And 2015, we get the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction signed. And I think this is quite pivotal, certainly for us, because it's got the goal to prevent, it's really clear about preventing new and reducing existing disaster risk. So it's about how you tackle risk to stop emergencies in the first place, really. And it talks about a whole range of measures and thematic areas so that we prevent and reduce the exposure of people to risk and the vulnerability of people to all types of hazards. So it's hazard agnostic. You know, it's about all different hazards, although it doesn't cover conflict. And it also talks about increasing the preparedness for the response, because however much you put into prevention, stuff's likely to go wrong. And also to the recovery from disasters. So this is a really important moment for Greater Manchester, I think, because it really starts to open up the thinking around disaster risk reduction. Although somebody once told me we don't have disasters in the UK, we just have emergencies. So there you go. The Making Cities Resilient initiative then has these 10 essentials for cities. So one of the things that you hear me talk about all the way through is about working at the local level, working at the city level. And this is where something like the Making Cities Resilient initiative that the UN convene is so important, because it's about collaborative working across the world between cities. Why is that important? Well, hopefully one city doesn't experience too many emergencies, in a short space of time. So it is important that we learn from the experience of other cities. And then when we look at new risks coming up, we're not going to do all the good ideas, all the innovation is happening around the world, and we need to learn from one another. So that's why this is important to us. So Greater Manchester has 10 councils in it, and all 10 sign up to the Making Cities Resilient initiative. And this is designed to help cities become inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable by 2030. And those of you that know your Sustainable Development Goals will just have heard SDG 11 in there. And it also is about implementing the Sendai Framework, the Paris Agreement and the New Urban Agenda. So when I wrote the talks, this is like just a couple of days ago, there were 1,659 cities in the Making Cities Resilient programme, with over 500 million people in the world living in Making Cities Resilient cities. 3,000 of those, roughly, are Greater Manchester. Concepts that this brings about are really helpful. So sometimes I get asked questions about why do you spend time in these partnerships? But it's really helped us to think through disaster risk reduction. We've used the 10 essentials as a strategic framework before now to guide our activity. If you were to critique them, I think I'd say the one that was missing, and we spotted it before COVID, was public health. And I think now there is an attempt to add public health into these. There have been tools for measurement. The measurement of resilience, if any of you are into that, is, I think, a challenge and ongoing challenge. But there's certainly a disaster resilience scorecard that we helped pilot through this. And working with the UN and cities in Italy and Portugal, we designed a peer review tool so that really you could get a qualitative assessment of your resilience by inviting in practitioners from other cities to take an independent look at what you were doing, give you some new perspectives and some new suggestions. So that was us, sort of 2014, 2015. And then 2017, there was a global competition, and we were very privileged to join the 100 Resilient Cities. So this was set up by the Rockefeller Foundation. It's since become a city-led, a city-driven network, the Resilient Cities Network. But this one, it really focuses on thought leadership. You know, it's really trying to push the boundaries on our thinking and what we're going to do around resilience. And it also brings resilience projects to the local level. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to Greater Manchester. Yeah? Oh, good, good. Right, for those of you that haven't, I obviously take a particular slant to where this is concerned. I want to say Greater Manchester is safe, it's beautiful, it's a great place to work and to visit. But I'll just talk you through some of the things we're doing. So, Resilient Cities Network have partnered with Zurich Foundation to do some work in communities to look at how we co-design with communities some adaptation measures to tackle climate change risk. So locally, we've got two communities, completely different. We've got one in Wigan, it's Higher Folds in Wigan. And the reason we're working with that community is it's a very sort of defined community set in a rural environment, one road in, one road out. Primary risk is probably flooding, but also it sits on the edge of some of the old coal fields that you find around Greater Manchester. And those coal fields are on fire, and we can't put them out. So you've got an underground fire busy approaching this community. Apparently you can tell where the front of the fire is because it will burn out the tree roots and then the trees fall over. So you can tell how far it's advancing. So you just look at that risk profile. It's not the only place in the world facing this either. And that's just quite an interesting community and dynamic to work with. We're also working with Edgeley, which is just on the edge of Stockport. So if you come up the West Coast Main Line, come through Stockport, look out of the train to your left and you see Edgeley. But if you looked out of the train to your right, there's a massive redevelopment of Stockport town centre going on. It's got walkways, it's got urban parks, it's got architecture, that's just wonderful. So Edgeley is a serious risk if there's a heat wave. It's a very sort of built-up area. It's very traditional. And so we're working with that because it's potentially at risk of gentrification because of the development next door, but it's also at risk of heat. So Resilient Cities Network is helping us to work with those two communities to understand what interventions might be helpful. Another example of what they do, and it's just to give you a feel for what resilience looks like at that really local level, is they're working with Howden insurance brokers. And obviously insurance is something that we can all do, actually, to mitigate the effects of risk. We can take out insurance. But we're going to be doing a project with the insurance sector and our water provider to look at the costs of failing to adapt to climate change risks. So what would be the costs of doing nothing? And part of that is to build the business case for investing in these risks, because if you've looked at investment in resilience, it can be really difficult to get people to do it because you're trying to prevent something. So if it doesn't happen, is that because your intervention was really good and worked, or is it because it wasn't going to happen anyway? So it's quite a difficult argument, this one. So moving on from that, in about 2020, I'm still on my timeline, we launch our resilience strategy. And there's only a few of these in the UK. I think we've got one, London, Glasgow's I've seen. Bristol have one. But there is an ambition that every local resilience forum in the country will design its own resilience strategy. So to start to give more visibility, more direction to this agenda. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but just to say that we picked 5 priorities. The communities are deliberately priority number 1, because any emergency, any disaster is in the end intensely personal. It affects people, their families, their communities. The others are not hierarchical. Discovery is about understanding risk, emerging trends, emerging themes. It's about pushing the boundaries on what we mean by resilience and what we can do. Leadership's because if you don't have good leadership, you're not going to get investment, you're not going to get the traction to make changes. Place, because in the end, resilience happens in a place. And lots of the way we design our built environment, our green infrastructure, our grey infrastructure, that's all going to affect our resilience. And then response, because, as I said, at the end of the day, things keep happening. And just in terms of our resilience strategy, we want resilience to be a theme. I suppose the nearest I can get to is themes like the environment and the green agenda, or maybe inclusivity and equality, that it underpins all the decisions that we make. You know, we want to embed this across everyday life and across all the policy decisions that we make locally. And it's all about avoiding new risk, quite difficult to do, reducing existing risk and managing the residual risk. And eventually about surviving and thriving. And they're the 2 positives, to survive and thrive. So that picture is Greater Manchester. It's our Christmas markets, just before you think I've moved us to somewhere else in the world. But I wanted to talk a little bit about governance because I'm talking to a group of academics. I'm going to take the moment to say that academics keep telling me that resilience is a concept that's all about systems leadership, systems of systems even. And it's all about, and that's correct, it's all about recognising the interconnections of people and places in cities, about recognising the connections between cities, and also about understanding the rapid pace of change. So how we govern that system is really important. Now, one of my new acronyms that I've got, it's not my acronym, it's just one that I've come across recently, is one of the reasons that this is really important is we apparently live in a tuna world. Have you all come across the tuna world? It's the update, I think, on VUCA. So it's turbulent, uncertain, novel and ambiguous. Okay? And in order to deal with that, it needs a collective effort. But I think perhaps by necessity, city governance is often siloed. And in a way, that makes sense. You know, we have experts working on the built environment, on the green agenda. They're different experts from those who work on homelessness. And yet somehow resilience wants to pull all of those together. So the way we try to think about governance is that you're going to have an ecosystem. It's really, it might be led in one place, but to be honest, it involves all aspects of governance in the city. So I've got the Greater Manchester Resilience Forum at the top, and that is, as we've talked about, the sort of statutory partnership, if you like, that's got the lead for resilience. But it's much more around emergency preparedness and response, as I mentioned. We then do a lot of work about trying to engage stakeholders, so bringing in lots of people, lots of different perspectives. So I've listed there just 3 of them. We've got our 10 local authorities that we bring together in a separate way to think about resilience and then feed it into the forum. We've got the health sector. You know, that is a very large, very complex ecosystem, and it comes together to feed in. And then the voluntary community and social enterprise sector, which does include faith as well. And we've got something like 14,000 VCSE organisations in Greater Manchester. So these are big stakeholder groups that we're trying to work with. And then our other approach is to say, well, we probably can't, well, we know we can't do it all ourselves. So let's talk to all the governance groups that are looking at specific themes in Greater Manchester. And we're very lucky we have good systems leadership across all areas of Greater Manchester. So all of these groups that I'm mentioning, they're multi-agency, they're often private, public, academic organisations involved. So we are part of the Strategic Infrastructure Board, trying to look at the infrastructure of the future. We've got the Economic Resilience Group, which is so important, you know, in terms of underpinning livelihoods and prosperity. And then our Natural Capital Group, looking at blue and green infrastructure, biodiversity. So that's not the only people we talk to, but I thought I could do a whole hour on just who we're talking to, which probably wouldn't be very interesting. But the other thing that I wanted to touch on was political engagement. So this is really important, and I'll pick up again on it later, but it's really important to raise the political and strategic visibility of resilience. If you want to make a difference, you've got to have senior people and politicians involved. So the upshot of that is that you're trying to get resilience built into multiple policy decisions and also investment decisions. You know, we want the investment in resilience, we want the capacity to make a difference. Now, we've trialled a range of models in Greater Manchester, but we're now going to introduce a Greater Manchester Mayoral Resilience Group. So we've put the terms of reference on there. They're draft because we haven't actually set it up yet, but this is our ambition. And the really nice thing about Greater Manchester is that our Deputy Mayor, our Mayor, are part of the combined authority on which sit the leaders of all 10 councils in Greater Manchester. So the sort of reach of that is considerable for us. So that's enough about governance, and I'll move on to some of our risks. So although I've tried to say that resilience is a broader concept than risk management, I'll still always come back to the fact that risk remains sort of a bedrock of the resilience agenda. For me, it's an attempt to define and describe what it is we're being resilient to. Resilience can be very, very broad, and it can incorporate an awful lot of topics and themes. And so this is one way of trying to focus some of that resilience activity. So there's a growing sort of menagerie, I think is the best word, of risk descriptors. When I started, we just talked about likelihood and impact, okay? Now we have black swans. We have black jellyfishes, I don't know if you come across them. We have white elephants, and we have grey rhinos. So there's quite a menagerie of risk descriptors coming out. We're still fairly traditional. Probably sitting at the top of our risk register at the moment, which, remember, it only has a sort of 3-year time horizon. We've still got pandemics sitting at the top, flooding, because we've got 3 big rivers come through Greater Manchester, severe winter weather despite climate change and a distinctly wet, it's felt like it hasn't stopped raining in Greater Manchester all winter. So severe winter weather, and actually some of the infrastructure risks, so electricity transmission failure. So what I've put up there is some of the risks we've experienced have turned themselves into emergencies in the last 5 years. And I was quite interested by the breadth of them, really, that we've had infectious disease. I mean, we're dealing with measles at the minute. Could take time out to just say, if you haven't been vaccinated, please consider it. But we've got the infectious disease risks. We've got the natural hazards. You know, we've had flooding. We had Storm Franklin and Storm Christoph, which within just about 12 to 14 months led us to two times where we were issuing severe flood warnings, you know, about severe risk to life and trying to evacuate up to 2,000 properties. We've had, I'll come to some severe winter weather that we dealt with in 2018. We've had problems with essential services and our infrastructure. You know, Storm Arwen, which only touched lightly on Greater Manchester, that was the one where the wind came from the wrong direction and took out a lot of the electricity supplies. I'm trying to tell you about Toddbrook Reservoir very carefully, which was the reservoir dam up at Whaley Bridge, which is actually Derbyshire, that threatened failure a couple of years ago. And that one, the sort of, if they had the water come out, it would have come through Greater Manchester. So that was one of the cross-boundary risks we've got. We had the Bolton Cube fire, which was, it was a cladded building, so it happened after Grenfell Tower. But that was a block of student accommodation that caught fire. And then, of course, we've had the malicious risks, so the Manchester Arena attack. And I'll touch a little bit on a few of them because they do shape our approach to resilience. So I know I'm going back a bit, but Storm Eva was really significant flooding that we experienced in 2015. And we had 9 of our 10 boroughs affected. The borough that wasn't affected, Stockport, flooded 6 months later, so it kind of joined in a bit later on. We had about 3,000 properties flooded. We had a Grade 2 listed building washed away, which I just think, you know, the impact of emergencies on your cultural heritage is important. We don't always look at that in this country. We had lots of infrastructure affected. We lost our electricity supplies. The water's interesting because we lost electricity, we lost the telemetry on an underground reservoir in Greater Manchester. And then we got rung up by residents in Oldham going, we've no water. And of course, we're splashing about in our wellies in lots of water, but it was because that reservoir had drained because they'd lost the telemetry on the reservoir. There was the potential for lots of cascading consequences. You know, I sometimes think in emergencies, you can sometimes feel that could have been so much worse. You know, we had industrial sites that were threatened, there were potential landslips that would have affected our water supply. It was obviously putting pressure on reservoirs. It was Boxing Day. So you can imagine that that's when everybody's in work and raring to go. No, not at all. So, you know, you're trying to manage this with calling lots of people in and away from, you know, eating up the Christmas leftovers. And then it brings out just how prolonged recovery is. You know, we still, when it rains heavily and we put flood warnings out, we are still contacted by residents who were affected by this flood because they live in fear that it's going to happen again. You know, their properties have been restored, their lives arguably are back to some sort of normality, but that fear of flooding occurring again stays with them. Now, I was trying to think, you know, in terms of how this shapes our approach to resilience. I mean, I think there were improvements made to our infrastructure. So lots of our electricity substations had flood protection put in. And lots of the flood defences were inspected and improved. But that long recovery period and the psychological anxiety that sits with it, I think that's guided us, and we'll see that in the Arena attack, about really starting to understand the psychological impacts of emergencies and the need to properly respond to that and try to support people. And the other thing this has led to, you know, a number of years on, but we now have, we're doing an integrated water management plan that is starting to look on a much more holistic basis at how we manage too much water, too little water, and the quality of water across Greater Manchester. And hopefully that sort of work will reduce the chances of this occurring in the future. This was the River Irwell that flooded. Beast from the East. Now, this is the one where my reflection is this is an emergency you could have failed to see happening under your nose, to be honest. So, highest motorway in England, and it's closed due to high winds and snow. So, you know, we knew that infrastructure was susceptible to severe winter weather. Now, I can never remember the statistics, but if you get backing up on a motorway, there's something like a mile a minute and 1,000 people in every mile. You know, the numbers are enormous, but don't quote me on that. You have to go and look them up. But, you know, we had the equivalent of a small town trapped at the top of our motorway, and it's really hostile. Motorways are hostile. The top of that hill is hostile. It's just, you know, very, very difficult. Now, the highways agencies, and they're not called that anymore, but at the time, their role is to keep roads moving. That's what they do. They keep our transport moving. So they're up there trying to reopen this motorway as fast as they can. What they wanted to do was take out the central reservation, and then all the motorists can turn round and come back down the other side, and then at least they're off the motorway and they're safe. Some of the challenges for us was, how on earth do you know what's going on? Because there's nobody up there except all the people trapped in their cars. So you've got some stuff coming in from the people who are trapped, but it's very different. Lots of emergencies will go. The emergency services will go to scene and you'll get a readout from the scene. This one's very challenging. And it's very challenging to actually get anybody up there. So I got a phone call when this was happening and said, Kathy, you know, we want to open a shelter, a rest centre for the people that are trapped in their vehicles at the top of the hillside. I'm like, how do we intend to do that? You know, is there a building, for starters, you know, and really are we going to send council officials, you know, up there, you know, with very little training in how to work in those sorts of conditions, try and look after people? So we talked about military aid and mountain rescue and the services that are really well equipped to start dealing in these sorts of conditions. What I will say is the reason it's the emergency that you might not have noticed till it became really catastrophic was because obviously the highways engineers are working flat out to take out that central reservation. 5 more minutes. Just 5 more minutes, just 10 more minutes, another 5 minutes. And time was creeping. And you know that message that you get, if you're travelling on the motorway in this weather, please take warm clothing, possibly a thermos and a blanket. No, not on the M62. So we've got people in office clothing. You know, you've inevitably got a baby at the front, you know, most difficult to get to. You've got people getting really cold. They're running out of, the mobile phones are running out of power. 5 more minutes. And you add up all those 5 more minutes. And, you know, these are the people that are absolutely working their socks off to get that central reservation, you know, opened and people moving off. So everybody came off that motorway. We didn't lose anybody, and it was resolved. But it was one of the cautionary tales for me. With hindsight, dead easy. But at the time, 5 more minutes. That's all I need. Okay? So, that's my cautionary tale. Way it shapes resilience is that understanding about the slow burn, these sort of rising tide events they're sometimes called, but also really highlights understanding of place. You know, really understanding where this was, what there was around, and the specific local conditions that we were facing. And then the other one I'll just mention is the Manchester Arena attack. Now, I'll talk about this from a local authority perspective. Obviously, there was a multi-agency response to the Manchester Arena attack, and it led to the Manchester Arena inquiry, which, if you read it, and I know somebody in the audience has, then in part, it is a study on the effectiveness of cross-system working and that sort of systems working that we said that local resilience forums ought to be able to do and to lead. So, 22nd of May 2017, we have a suicide bomber detonating an improvised explosive device at the Manchester Arena. And it's the close of an Ariana Grande concert, so we've got about 14,000 people from across the country. If you plotted where people came from, you literally plot out the main transport routes across the country. There's 22 deaths, over 300 injured, and that doesn't include all the people with psychological and emotional trauma. And I will say in that there is the concept of sort of parity of esteem, that initially it's perhaps easier to see those physical injuries, but those mental injuries can be as devastating for the people affected. It's probably the largest and most complex incident that Manchester has dealt with. And like many incidents, in the first few hours, it's really unclear what had happened. You know, there was talk of balloons exploding or power outages, or, you know, because people are trying to make sense of what's going on but don't have the facts. Obviously, a large number of victims and the support required. Now, we get a multi-agency response. We put in place 24-hour command centre, so we bring all agencies into one place so that we can work together in the response. Within 12 hours, we've got the consequence management cell established. Now, that's a way, it's a concept that we put in place to make sure that we can have dialogue with communities, so that we've got a two-way feed coming in and out of that cell, that group of people, understanding what local impacts are, actively communicating and messaging people. And that was really important because we did the response for 9 days. You know, even Storm Eva had been 24 hours. Beast from the East is a number of hours. This is a 9-day response, and that doesn't even touch recovery. And that's partly because we don't know at the early stages where the bomber had worked, who else had been working with him. So you've got a series of arrests going on across the city and with explosive entry into properties. So you've got a lot of issues for the communities involved. The council opens a reception centre at the Etihad Stadium. Now, I don't know what your football preferences are, but after this, we had an inquiry, a very quick inquiry, the Kerslake Arena review. And one of the members on the panel said, you know, it was fortuitous that you chose the Etihad Stadium rather than Man U, because United is red and Manchester City is blue. And so it's very calming. And I was fascinated, but the number of times colour comes up. I've been muted again by the host. No, it's okay, I'll try and keep going. So the number of times colour comes up as a consideration. You know, there's a softer, if you like, side to emergency response as well. So we open a reception centre at the Etihad. Now, the intention initially was that this would be for the children and the people going to the concert who were struggling to get home, and it would give them a safe place to come and be reunited with family and friends. What happens over time is that the people who come to the Etihad Stadium are the people their family and their friends weren't going to be coming home. So it becomes a place where the bereaved gather. Now, one of the things that we did, I would normally say that in an emergency, don't invent new ways of working. It's not the time. You can reflect in your own time about COVID, yeah, where in order to manage that emergency, there probably were new ways of working put into place. But emergencies often aren't the time for that. But what we did do here was we asked bereavement nurses to come in and sit with people, and we hadn't done that before. But they have the skills to sit alongside people through their journey. So that was something good that we did. There was huge media interest. So one of the things that you'll get at any major emergency is significant media interest. And some of it, if you read the reports, was very difficult, very intrusive, very, you know, at points, I think, underhand in terms of trying to get access to people. So I've already mentioned this is 9 days of response. And then the council at this time, it's not only dealing with people who are bereaved, people who are injured, trying to put the support in place, but we've got a role in terms of civic leadership, so bringing the city together, and also there are messages about it being open for business. So 23rd of May, so that's the next day, there's a vigil held outside the town hall, 3,000 people attending, and we have a huge role in terms of big events about keeping people safe. And this was so important because it demonstrated the solidarity of Manchester's communities for those that have been affected. The floral tributes, I know this isn't a good image, but the reason I chose, it's the only one I can find that shows just the scale of the floral tributes. Now, they started to be put all the way across the city, and the leader of the council, and this is about leadership, came out of the town hall and said there were flowers dotted about, and he picked up some of the flowers and he asked some of the media to pick up the flowers and others, and he asked them to follow him to St Anne's Square, that's St Anne's Square in the picture. And they moved the floral tributes down to St Anne's Square so that it could become a place to remember, to grieve, to pay respects. And we were very lucky, the British Red Cross came and supported so that people had support when they went to St Anne's Square. Just to say, I know it's at the bottom of the slide, but those flowers, they were all picked up afterwards and they were composted. And the compost from the flowers was used to plant 28 trees of hope in the city. So on the first anniversary, people could leave messages on the trees of hope. And all the candle stubs that had been burnt in St Anne's Square were picked up, and 22 pillar candles were made out of them. And they were burnt at in the cathedral at the interfaith service that marked the first anniversary. So for us as a council, it's really important how when you think about what you do with tributes and the gifts and things that people have left. We have another vigil in St Anne's Square, 4,000 people. And then some of you might remember 4th of June, we had the One Love concert, attended by 50,000 people. And that raised £7.2 million for the victims. It was the largest single donation into the We Love Manchester Fund. And so I can give a much longer presentation about this, but I think the message for us is you've not only got the direct impacts, which are absolutely horrific on the people that are directly affected, but this also has the potential to spread fear and division across our communities. And so building community cohesion and working with our communities was really important. And my final slide on this one is remembrance. And remembering is really important. And I think you'll see the anniversaries of different emergencies come through. There was the anniversary of the Moorgate train crash recently. And I think there was a debate about why do we keep remembering. And I think it's almost the question should be, why wouldn't we keep remembering? This is part of people's ongoing lived experience. There are people who will be grieving throughout their lives because of this attack. And emergencies, I'm being unmuted again. Emergencies are part of the history of a place. And they can define a place. So there'll be some places and some place names that you know because of what happened there in terms of a bombing or an attack. The emergencies can be a time of building legacy. So from the Manchester Arena attack, you'll hear about Martin's Law, which is the work of Fegan Murray in memory of her son, Martin Hett. And she is trying to make venues a safer place for all of us to visit and prevent other families suffering in the way that she and others did in the Manchester Arena attack. So that's the sort of looking at what's happened and I'd like to just sort of close really by looking at the way forward. So I started my timeline for Greater Manchester in 2004 with the Civil Contingencies Act. And I was trying to say that was a really important moment in UK resilience. You know, it shaped 20 years of work. And as I speak to you now, I think we're at another absolutely pivotal moment, and probably the most transformative there's been since the Civil Contingencies Act in resilience in this country. So why do I say that? It's a big sell for the UK government resilience framework. There's lots of commentary about the UK government resilience framework. It was published in December 2022. I see I daren't touch. So now, I've lost my echo, good. So published December 2022. And there were 3 core pillars of it. And it's about understanding risk. So what it's actually picking up is the pace of change in the world. So you've got technological change, you've got a changing climate, you've got conflict risks, you've got economic risks around the world. And there's the concept of polycrises, the other issue being that these things don't happen one by one, they're tending to come together. And all of this is accompanied by things happening more frequently, at a greater scale, with really far-reaching consequences. And the fact we're interconnected. So stuff that happens in one place in the world can affect us, or vice versa. So it's really important that we understand the future that we might face, the uncertainty in that, and feed that into our understanding of risk. It also talks about a greater emphasis on prevention of emergency and bringing everybody to play a role in resilience. So this whole of society approach. It's businesses as well as sort of communities. It's all citizens having a role to play. And I'll just move on. So the government's looking at implementing the aspirations in that government resilience framework. And in part, it's doing that at the local level through the Stronger Local Resilience Forums programme. So that's another acronym, isn't it? SLRF. Now, it's picking up on the need for political leadership. So I talked about that earlier. But really it's looking at that political leadership in terms of driving resilience of place, because lots of local councillors, for example, are involved in local decisions about the built environment, how our towns and cities run. So they have a role to play in terms of this. And it's also looking at the role of local councillors, MPs, etc., in terms of they are who we elect to represent us, they're democratically accountable, so they have a role in terms of working with communities, arguably, to build resilience and get some of the messaging out there. The stronger leadership bit is actually about, in part, having a chief resilience officer, as I mentioned, in every local resilience forum in the country. So there's a question mark about what is the post of a chief resilience officer and what does it do? At the moment, I'm still here. We'll see if I am in 12 months' time. And then there's this idea that you build resilience into how we call it place shaping, place making, all the policies that affect a place. We're one of 8 pilot areas in the UK looking at this. And it's the point that I did mention this earlier before we started, that I think for me, and this is a personal view, it brings out 3 particular areas of resilience. So I think you've still got the major incident crisis management, emergency management. And actually, although the government resilience framework talks about risk, I'm not sure how much the Stronger LRFs programme and the investment into LRFs is driving an enhancement of that major incident and crisis management capacity. And the reason I think that's important to note is that whether we look at Grenfell Tower inquiry, COVID-19 inquiry, Manchester Arena inquiry, I think we would all acknowledge we still have lessons to learn and work to do. So that is a personal view, but I'll just share that. Where this Stronger LRFs programme really majors on is that whole of society approach and embedding resilience across all policy areas, the place-based resilience. This slide is really showing you what we're already doing in each of those areas, because part of what we want to do is to build on the work that we already do within Greater Manchester. Whether this programme will be led through the local resilience forum is a different matter. I would like that to continue to focus on crisis emergency management, and really that the leadership for community resilience and place-based resilience sits somewhere else. So with the people who would do that as part of their day job. So just in terms of what we're doing, we've decided to really focus on 5 areas. So this is a 2-year pilot, and we're just going to focus on 5 areas to see, what we can do, what we can strengthen. So we are looking at putting some of the resources that we will get into strengthening that partnership environment. And one of the things, if anybody ever wants to talk to me about it, is I'm really trying to understand systems, leadership, systems approaches, and how you make them work in practice. What can we do to really, really uplift this and make it better? We're looking at, I told you about the GM Mayoral Resilience Group. That's us engaging democratically elected councillors so that we've got more political engagement. It's a thorny issue. I mean, just before, I make it sound simple, but if you think about the protests in London round about Remembrance Sunday, and you think about the debates that were going on about the operational independence of the police. So when you talk about political engagement in resilience, are you talking about political direction of the emergency response? Or are you talking about that role of politicians in working with communities and how we build our places? So although it looks straightforward, there are concerns and caveats. The coroner is also independent. And of course, some of our emergencies lead us to work with the coroner. What we are looking at is how we use risk. So we're, as part of Framework in the UK, we assess risks. I think it seems to me annually. I have big question marks, and what I really want to explore through is how we then use that information. I mean, all of our risk assessments, I don't know where you live, but for your area, somewhere, there will be a community risk register. And that is your way of finding out the risks that might affect you in your day-to-day life, and how many of you have read it, let alone acted on it. And so I just think we ought to be doing this a bit better and communicating risk better. We want to look at exploring vulnerability. There are a lot of issues about how you support, how you define and how you support vulnerable people in a crisis. There's a lot of thinking around that. We have an ageing hub. It's not a hub that's ageing. It all sounds wrong to me, but we have real experts in Greater Manchester who work on the older people's agenda. And we know that older people are more likely to die in heat waves. They're more likely to die in severe winter weather. We gloss over that as 3,000 excess deaths. We don't stop and think that's 3,000 people who died because it got hot. And if you think about being flooded, if you were, say, 85 and your home's flooded, how do you start again? So what we're looking at is we're taking just one cohort and we're seeing if we can explore the concepts of vulnerability in depth. And then we'll take some of the principles and hopefully look at some work with younger people as well. And then place-based resilience is huge. It's an enormous agenda. So what we've decided to look at is water and our water infrastructure and water management, and the programme that I was telling you about, the integrated water management plan, and make it say resilience every second word and try and get some benefits out of that. So what we're trying to do in the next 2 years is really create a real change in how we understand resilience and how we take our work forward from that point. Why does it matter? I don't know if you've seen this slide before. It comes from 100 Resilient Cities. And what it's trying to say is that every city and the communities within it have an aspiration, that path of development where they want to grow economically, what they want the city to look like in the future. And if you get a shock, an emergency, it can really knock you off track. You know, and there are places that just disappear because of something that happens to them. So that's the bottom line. But if you are prepared and if you know what you want to do, sometimes an emergency can present an opportunity and you can actually take your city to a new trajectory. And my best example of that probably, I think, is the IRA bombing of Manchester in 1996. And there was a really clear vision, nobody died, and there was a really clear vision of how the city needed to look in the future. And so because, you know, there was so much destruction in the city centre, the way it was rebuilt was very different to how it had looked before. So that really is me for today. You'll understand I can talk quite a lot. So if you want to follow up on anything, I've got my email address there. But for me, I think resilience is something that's really crucial. You know, it's about how we protect people. It's about how we care for people. It's about how we enable people to be safe. And when you've got that right, then people can flourish and thrive. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cathy.
Okay, so right, I think that's a really interesting question. I think there's some basics that it is very helpful for everybody to think about. So I think things like getting insurance, and it might sound easy, but for people who are struggling financially, getting that insurance in place is difficult. The UK has looked at new insurance mechanisms as well, because people who were in flood areas were struggling to get insurance, but we now have Flood Re that supports the provision of insurance to those who might flood. So I think insurance is one area that could be looked at. The other one is early warning. So we actually have, I think, some fairly good early warning systems in the UK. You know, we've got a lot of information from the Met Office, Flood Forecasting Centre. But I don't know yet that we're very clear on how much that shifts people's behaviours and their preparedness in case things happen. And again, there's as I mentioned earlier, there's a balance between too many warnings, warnings causing anxiety and concern, but then people taking appropriate action. We've got things like the UK threat levels, so around the security agenda, and again, people understanding what might be suspicious behaviour, how to report it. Another example, and I'll come to an issue about risk in a minute, is, say, moorland fires. They're devastating if they happen around Greater Manchester. They destroy habitats, they affect the biodiversity, they release carbon, very difficult to put out, often caused by barbecues, you know, and people going and having, you know, a bit of fun on the moors, which we would like, but not the barbecues. So part of the issue is, and I haven't resolved it in my own head, is that there's lots and lots of separate risks, and there's lots of information out about all those risks. And there's how you make that sense for individuals of all of that without the whole of life feeling unsafe. And I think what I quite like is there's an approach I've seen in Portugal where they've developed centres where school children might go, and they might learn about, you know, the risks in the home of the chemicals under the sink or the toaster under the kitchen cupboard and some of those risks. Then they might learn about the risks of needles in the street or not going and playing in the electricity cabinet or, you know, road safety. And then they move up to forest fires and tsunamis and earthquakes. So they use this idea of a sort of continuum of risk. And if you can start to develop behaviours that will keep you safe, they'll work through a range of risk. So I probably don't have an absolutely clear answer for you, but I think it's an area where we really need to think about what our messaging is. And I suppose one other thing I'd say is that if you teach people about risk throughout their lives, there must be a point at which you update that. Because, you know, as you go on through life, you gather more and more and more information, if you're so minded, about risk and what you shouldn't do. And then you can still be engaging in behaviours that actually you don't need to anymore because, you know, that particular risk, maybe it's a particular crime or something, is now very rare. So there's something about how we present information to people, what we expect people to do with that information, the choices they can make, and then how we update it as well. Do you have thoughts about what we should be doing?
I come from a background of having lived in different places with much higher daily levels of risk. And I think it's really interesting to see like the differences in individuals' mentalities towards those risks. And so I grew up in Anchorage in Alaska, and then also lived in Norway. And I think it's just a very different attitude to individual responsibility for risk. And I see the picture of the road with the snow on it and understand why it's a huge problem here, but also know that on an individual level, you could be prepared for that risk. Obviously, it's, you know, it doesn't happen all the time.
Yes.
It's not like it is in Anchorage, but it's sad. I don't know, not sad. It's interesting to see that in some places that kind of thing just would not register as a problem, and to understand how we can learn lessons from those places while still being proportionate to the general levels of risk that.
Yes. And I think that's interesting because sometimes I look at other areas in the world which are good at some types of risk, but they are a risk that is almost a single risk focus or a smaller basket of risks. So there's a lot of focus on being safe for those few risks, but people really understand them and are prepared to carry out drills or, you know, think about what they might need to do should they occur. Whereas we seem to have a sort of broad plethora of risks, each one of which might become very serious, but rarely does. So yeah, it's an interesting perspective.
So how you see maybe some of the roles or structure of the resilience space changing in the future? I know some cities, for example, have like a hazard-specific resilience officer, like a chief heat officer in some cities. Do you see a role for those types of positions that could maybe like bridge silos between heat waves, say like healthcare, social care, built environment?
Yeah.
Or do you think that would further assign?
I think it's very interesting. So chief heat officers, I mean, looking at the heat experienced across the world last year and the impacts that it had, you can absolutely understand why you need an expert and a focus on heat. And I think whatever risk you're looking at, you probably do need your experts in that risk. So we have flood experts, we have the fire service that's looking at primarily one risk, although it now does a lot more. So I think that the siloing is it's the other side of my coin of systems. And I always think you're going to need an element of siloing in the sense that you need an expert. You need people who really understand your risk, really understand all the impacts it can have, really understand how we might mitigate it. You know, we've got security experts, I said fire, flood, water safety experts. But what we need is the capacity, like you say, to then support them working across other disciplines and bringing them in. So we're trying to do some work on heat in Greater Manchester. Now I say this after my rainy winter. And it's probably a risk that most people wouldn't recognise in Greater Manchester. But if you want to put the mitigation in, you want to be planting your trees now. You want to be looking at the buildings we're putting up now and think about the finish on them, the surfaces, their orientation, their ventilation. You want to be thinking about how you get sort of air movement through our urban spaces and much more than that. So I think, you know, in answer to your question, yes, you absolutely need the people who can understand and advocate for particular risks, but you need to give them a way of connecting to and influencing other agendas so that you take the preventative action that you can take in a timely way. You know, it's not, we shouldn't wait for the heat wave and then plant a sapling. Somebody said to me the other day, if you're ever in doubt about what to do, plant a tree. I said, yeah, a bit bored one afternoon, plant a tree. Pay dividends in the future.
Wonderful. Has anyone else got a question? I mean, I have a question. You go first, Sarah.
I don't know if it's too specific, but I was thinking, you know, when you were talking about Manchester and being bombing, and then obviously all the follow-up kind of tributes, which of course you then need to have some kind of crowd control, protect the crowds in those spaces. And I was just thinking about the huge number of people you would need working on the scene. And how do you deal with the kind of fluctuations in the number of people, the number of responders that you need from kind of the baseline to, you know, because obviously I assume you can't pay all these people the whole time, so you have volunteers, you have temporary staff, but it was just something I was wondering how to deal with the fact that you're dealing with needs for staff like that, and how do you plan for that and manage it?
So there's a number, I mean, it is a really good question because you're absolutely right. At a time like that, you don't want to be hunting for staff or not doing things well because you're not resourced. I think, so there's a number of things in place. One is agencies like, organisations like the police work across on a national basis. So they can redeploy people, if you like, just move them across from one area of the country to somewhere that's in need. And they can bolster numbers in that way. We try to build and have strong links with a series of voluntary organisations, and they can bring in volunteers to support what we're doing in different events. And probably the other one, they would argue very carefully about their involvement, but is the military. So we have agreements between the civil authorities and the military that if a situation is life-threatening, they can immediately support us to save life. Longer-term deployment obviously needs ministerial approval to put troops on the streets, that sort of thing. You know, it's but there's a number of mechanisms, whether it's through, you're right, sort of bringing people in from other areas of the country, military aid, volunteers to try and bolster numbers and put the resources in place. There is, and I also don't want to veer too much into political territory, but there is a debate at the minute about a lot of the, so if you read the National Risk Register, it outlines a series of risks. And there's arguably an assumption in it that some of the mitigations for those risks work. So whether it's the health service or some local authority services. So there is a question, I think, going forwards about how robust some of those public services are that we might expect to step in. And I mean, I was just interested, Birmingham, one of the things I think they're disinvesting in is some of the flood defences. So, and this is where it becomes very difficult to make some of the arguments about investment when your other option is to just hope it won't happen. It's not the strongest of strategies, but, you know, sometimes things don't happen for a while. So, yeah.
I was thinking about this in the context of, I know I've heard a narrative about some of the protests that have been going on at the moment, and you know the difficulty with policing those, because you're bringing in maybe into London or into the big cities, so you're bringing in your police forces from elsewhere, but it means that kind of day-to-day policing for lower level events is obviously then diminished in those areas if this kind of thing continues. And it wasn't really a question, it's just I just find it must be, I mean, so challenging.
Yeah, and I think if I just relate that to my own service, you know, on a day-to-day basis, we're assessing risks, we're writing plans, we're training people, we're holding exercises, we're trying to influence, you know, the policymakers I've been talking about. But if an emergency happens, the rule in my service is you drop everything else and you attend to that emergency, because there's an immediate risk to life, an immediate risk of suffering, an immediate risk to the environment. So COVID was interesting because we put some of that business as usual either on hold or operating at a much lower level for a relatively extended period of time. And so I'd say when COVID sort of the activity around that diminished, I don't think people in my area, and you probably see this echoed across other services, they didn't see any diminishing in their workload, because then they're trying to catch back up with stuff that was sort of suspended or deprioritised in order to deal with the immediacy of the emergency. So it's a really good point.
Can I ask a question? Just a really quick one then, because we've got another question and then we'll wrap up. But just a really quick one, just sort of off the back of the many points that you made there. What are the challenges of working across different resilience local forums? Because you know, on the radio this morning, we've heard about various councils really struggling with finances. So if you have a situation where one of the forums are not now investing in certain things, like de-investing in water or flood protection, that might have a consequence in a whole different area. And so how is there like a joined upness towards these different forums across the UK that are, because potentially we're now going to start seeing all sorts of hazards impacting that wouldn't have done before because of those limitations. So I just wondered what the communication was between them.
Yes, I think I've kind of mentioned uncertain futures, and to a certain extent, I think, you know, one of the principles we've got is about being flexible, it's about being dynamic, and it's about adapting to the situations that you face. I think some of what we might look at in terms of sort of the cuts to public services is something that, you know, a little bit uncharted territory. The local resilience forums do work together. They work across boundaries, but they also come together and are convened nationally, so that there is an attempt to join up and have a view across the sort of resilience of the UK. And it's an interesting area because a lot of it's coordinated nationally, but for many emergencies there's a principle of subsidiarity, so your action is taken locally. Now, I think at the end of the day, and it's a personal view, for me, you know, it's about if lives are at risk, what do you do? And my tendency would be to go and help. You know, across boundary, it would be to help. But, you know, I think there are question marks, and the National Preparedness Commission have a lot of papers that are real thought pieces around this, and Lord Toby Harris has just published a paper about resilience and how the government might take it forwards, and probably in the context of your question it's worth a read. Well, it's worth a read anyway. Sounded wrong, but in the context of your question it's particularly pertinent.
Great, that's wonderful, thank you. And one last question.
Yeah. I guess I'm interested in, you mentioned the example of the Beast from the East of emergency, and then some of the findings from the ARENA inquiries. Maybe to get some of your thoughts and reflections on how you build situational awareness between well, firstly kind of between different agencies, and then how do you actually operate under emergencies when you don't know what's happening around you? When you mentioned on the slide the kind of the beast from the East example, the difficulties of achieving situational awareness, how do you operate under those kind of conditions?
Yeah, so again, I mean, it's a really good question. It goes to the heart of what we do, really, and it's probably a huge answer. So I'll try and just pick out a few points. I think one of the things that we do is we try to come together as agencies in command. So there are a series of principles that the Manchester Arena attack picked up on, the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Principles, or JESIP, and they talk about co-location, and whether that's co-location of commanders on the ground so that they're sharing their understanding of what they're dealing with on the ground, and we come together at a command centre. So again, we've got feeds coming in, and as a series of agencies we work together. And we also have pre-agreed command structures. So I'll go into the terminology, but you'll hear about strategic coordinating groups or tactical coordinating groups, which pull together all emergency responders to understand what are we facing, what are you all doing, what do we need to do. I think where there are challenges, situational awareness is always quite difficult. You're all, you know, it's that old adage, isn't it, of having a beach ball, a stripy beach ball, and depending on which side you're looking at, one person's seeing red and one's yellow and one's blue. But what we're trying to do is to come together. We will use all sorts of mechanisms. We'll use information from the public. You know, we're watching social media. We're understanding what the press are seeing. We put our own people on the ground if we can. I know drone footage has been used in some emergencies to support getting that overview, or you can, you know, other aerial surveillance can be used. I mean, a good example of that was we had tornado in Tameside, and the aerial footage of that, you know, just showed that path, you know, and it was extraordinary, you know, on a UK basis. So, and Beast from the East, you know, the police deployed a grid search mechanism, which they wouldn't normally do for situational awareness, but they were dividing the area up to try and get a view for what was going on in each of the different parts, and that was an approach we hadn't used before. So I think you've got sort of making use of the people on the ground, and that is your public, your volunteers, as well as your statutory agencies, the technology available to you, and then the command structures that you put in place to pull it together. COVID, because it's protracted, we had statistics coming in, you know, so we could see numbers of those with COVID, numbers of deaths, the impact it was having on domestic violence, you know, the number of arrests or other measures that were going on. You know, we had a lot of statistics that we looked at daily, weekly, on an appropriate frequency. And then I'd say the other thing we do, which is relevant, is after any major incident, we debrief or do a sort of after incident learning. So we're trying to pull out the sorts of lessons that, you know, I was going through today. But there's two parts to it. Yes, you're trying to look at where do you think you could have improved? You know, did something ostensibly go wrong, or at least could you have done it better? But the other bit you need to capture, which is actually challenging, is what went right. So, you know, I'd just say, if you're doing an assignment, how much do you get on what was good about it, as well as where you could improve? What's the balance between the two? And it's much the same comes through into our world, is what did we do right, as well as where could we improve? And the reason that is so important is that if it went right, if it was something that was helpful, if I do it again, it's likely to be helpful. If I didn't, you know, if you something you think you could have done better, the mechanism you put in place, even if you exercise it, is going to be untried until the next emergency. So it may or may not in the end be helpful. So it's really important, I think, that bit about what worked. So I hope that answers the question. It is probably an as answer all in its own right, you know, it's because it's such an important part of what we do. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Kathy. I think after all the talk of heat waves, beach balls and tuna, I want to go down to the beach now, but I fear we might be having a mini beast from the east instead. So anyway, so thank you very much, Kathy, for your talk. We really appreciate you coming and giving us your wisdom, and apologies for the technical issues, but thank you for being so resilient through it all. So thank you very much.
Thank you.